The early research was done on white, cis, hetero men and young boys. When I was looking at this report, Black girls were saying that they kind of did need more support, but they were kind of seen as just being rude, dismissive. When it comes to the education and health system, there's often been fraught relationships with the Black community. Black boys and girls tend to be more stigmatized. You don't want to be labeled as dyspraxic or having ADHD or anything like that, because that kind of seems like another label that's going to cause problems for you.
The Hidden 20% won Best Interview Podcast at the British Podcast Awards, and we couldn't have done it without you. Thank you for your support. We really want to do more, so follow, subscribe, and let's get this message out to more people. Abigail Agyei-Jones is an award-winning diversity and inclusion champion and neurodiversity advocate, with over a decade of experience as a senior policy advisor working with underrepresented communities. Named one of the top 50 influential neurodivergent women of 2022, Abigail has dedicated her career to creating inclusive spaces and driving systemic change. Abigail, though, like many women, slipped through the net and was diagnosed with ADHD later in life. Today, we unpack why that was. Let's get into it. Let's see how great minds think differently. Abigail, tell me about your journey with ADHD and dyspraxia.
It's definitely been a self-discovery journey that I feel I'm still on. We're always on and learning. I learned about my dyspraxia before my ADHD. So that was in university, where somebody else I knew thought they had dyspraxia, said they thought I had it, and thought I should get an assessment.
And why did they say that?
I think things with like spatial awareness, kind of seeing that the sports aspects, lots of sports were kind of happening in uni that were not my forte. I didn't enjoy. We talk about kind of how I couldn't ride a bicycle. I didn't like driving. Well, I couldn't drive. I tried doing driving learning tests and it just wasn't for me. And my handwriting as well, they said that as well. So I was like, okay, I might need to look into this. And then speaking about it with my mum, she was like, I've heard something like this before. When you were younger, you had a lot of issues with your posture. So had those assessments in university, and in my final year of uni found out I had dyspraxia.
And how did you then reflect back on growing up, school?
I definitely reflected and thought so many things were so much harder, and I felt like there was a lot of overcompensating because I found things hard. I think kind of back to often that judgment. As a tall Black girl in school, I think it was expected that I'd be really good at sports.
Okay.
And it was something that I wasn't too bad at running, but I hated netball. I went to a girls' secondary school and netball was a big thing. And for me, it was just too many rules. It was pivoting. It was my spatial awareness will have me always bashing into people. And I felt always like just a disappointment because people would look at me and be like, she's like someone who should be good at this stuff, like making those assumptions. And I just wasn't.
And what did you think about the fact that you didn't have that level of, I don't know, coordination or spatial awareness?
I just always thought, yeah, maybe it was just, I don't know, I'm just tall and I'm just a klutz and I'm just awkward. That's what I always thought it was. But I didn't understand why things were so hard for me. Why my left and right, knowing that was hard. And tying shoelaces, something I still, my shoelaces are always still loose. So, and opening things. So it just always felt like, why am I just, I don't know. I just always felt I'm awkward and I just can't do these things. But it was just always trying to find ways to do things differently or totally avoiding doing things. So yes. I would be the one who would kind of offer just avoid sports or things like that. I just realized reflecting on life, it was always having to try twice as hard as people where it just felt like things came so easy to others and people wouldn't realize how much you're putting into it to be only half as good.
And so then getting the assessment, learning about dyspraxia, what did you then, I'd never heard the word dyspraxia until 2 years ago.
Yeah, it's still, I feel from all the neurological conditions, it's still often ones where there's still quite a lack of understanding. So yeah, I feel like that's why weirdly, until I got my ADHD diagnosis, it was still something I kind of hid.
Okay.
Because there wasn't really a point of reference or understanding. I remember Googling and seeing that Daniel Radcliffe was someone I'd seen. So I was like, oh, Harry Potter has dyspraxia. And that was my only point of reference. So it was kind of still something that I would hide. I remember in my final year, that meant that I could get extra time for exams and stuff. And there was still quite a bit of shame. I feel like I still didn't really talk about it amongst friends. I didn't really want to speak about it with people. I remember for people who had kind of like additional needs of support, we'd be in another room for exams and I wouldn't really, people would ask why and I would kind of just not really want to talk about it. So I feel like there was still that shame and there wasn't really a point of reference of who to talk about it with.
No representation apart from Harry Potter.
Yes, apart from Harry Potter.
So fast forward to now, being dyspraxic, talking about it,
yes,
owning it. What's your sense of what's going on in society with dyspraxia?
I think it's definitely still not talked about as much as it could be, but I think there is so much, I think, a better understanding and compassion when it comes to neurological conditions and differences. There is more representation now, slowly getting there. There are people like, I talk about the Black dyspraxic, he's amazing, and I always see the work he does and just always finds ways to relate things. He literally had a LinkedIn post the other day about shoelaces, and I'm like, oh, this is a thing, like tying shoelaces is still hard for me at 33 years old.
But so you laugh, Abigail, which is amazing, and we're not here to it's not all doom and gloom, right?
Exactly.
But when, as I understand it, with something like dyspraxia, it can be really debilitating and pervasive when you're talking about things being popular at school and you not being able to do them.
Yes.
And things that are quote unquote simple and everyday, like tying shoelaces or not being able to pass your driving test.
Yes.
Or, these are quite important things.
Yes. And things that are kind of often seen as especially like passing your driving test, milestones into kind of adulthood. So I think, there's often been a lot of internalized shame and just keeping it moving and maybe kind of not making it seem like a personality trait. I'm like, oh, just driving's not my thing. I like which I do. I love public transport. I love getting on trains and buses, but kind of not really wanting to often delve into it. So that's why I have appreciated more of that community and kind of having those conversations that these things are kind of harder, but there's just different ways we go about doing things, and that's okay.
And you're going into all these organizations and companies. What's the response and awareness, do you think, around dyspraxia?
I think there's still a lot less understanding. People are really keen, which is important to talk about ADHD and autism, but less likely to kind of even have an understanding, and dyslexia. That's something that I think people have had more of an understanding from all the neurological conditions for a long time. But I think the dyspraxia, Tourette syndrome, or kind of other neurological conditions, there's just a lack of understanding. It's often when you have one, you have the other. It's been helpful kind of bringing them together to get people to understand. But understanding how it can affect people, especially in workplaces, I often talk about that kind of in terms of writing, mapping out thoughts, your timing, speech, even your speech awareness. And I thought about that and realized that I'm a very fast speaker, and I think it can often affect that when you're dyspraxic. So just really kind of getting people to understand in the workplace how it can affect people and those kind of tools to support people.
What do you think are the big myths about dyspraxia?
Just the idea maybe that people are kind of just klutz and trip up. I think with a lot of neurological conditions as well, it's not necessarily an effect on your intelligence, but it is kind of about the way you do things. So there just is a different way of doing things.
Yes.
And I think that's often the case, the misconception that people kind of will just push you to the corner because of those things.
And dyspraxia is not a physical condition. It's not that there's something physically wrong that means your body can't do what you want it to do. And I'm interested by the fact that, as you say, autism, ADHD, dyslexia, we have a lot more public knowledge around. Mm-hmm. But with that comes a lot more myths and stigma and stereotyping. And yet with something like dyspraxia or dyscalculia, we don't even know these words.
Yes.
And so we probably haven't even been able to form the stigma and the myths and the stereotypes because we don't even know the word. How do you describe dyspraxia to people?
I often tend to say it's something that affects your motor skills, your coordination, and your spatial awareness. So it can be kind of those difficulties with balancing, spatial awareness, as I said, things like tying your shoelaces. So kind of really kind of those hand-to-eye coordination. That's been something that's been difficult for me. Back to sports, rounders was big in my school as well. And I hated it because I'm like, I see it flying, I just can't coordinate the two. So yeah, we're getting people to really understand things like cooking, opening things.
Yes.
That's always been tin openers. Often could be the death of me. I find them so tricky. So it's just things like that, which back to that cultural element, I think is sometimes where I've had a lot of those internalized shame as well. Because being a Black African girl, you're expected to kind of cook and be cleansy. And those are things that I often would find hard. I think because of my dyspraxia and my ADHD, to kind of keep my space clean and find ways to do things and finding ways to open and use things.
I noticed that your shoes do not have shoelaces.
Not today. I do still have a lot of shoelaces, and they are constantly untied and not as tight as they should be. And my husband will see them and will just tighten them and be like, "What? Why are they like this?" And I'm like, "I don't know. I tied them as well as I could. I did a double knot. They're just not staying in."
How does your husband help you with your dyspraxia?
He's definitely very helpful at showing me how to do things a lot of the time. And that's something he's been good at, pushing me out of my shell. I feel like I've often just avoided certain things and I've just been used to doing that. So he's been good at being like, "Let me show you. I'll show you again. Let's do it again together." Helping with my space with kind of like boxes, and which helps with ADHD as well, because I am definitely a hoarder, although I'm sure we'll get to the ADHD side. And he said, because I've committed to saying next year I am going to go back to learning how to drive. I'm going to try. He's going to help. Him and my brother said they're going to work together to help me. So I think it is just having those people around you that you're comfortable and you feel that less shame and judgment for really helps. Because there can be a lot of internalized shame when you feel like you can't do things that feel so much simpler for other people.
Yeah, and you make a good point that maybe consciously or unconsciously, you just adapt. And so you just stop doing things or you just don't try things because, you just find other things to do or other ways to do things.
Yeah, and we'll just overcompensate trying to do other things well. So people might not notice you don't do those other things, or you can avoid doing those other things.
Yes. And so tell me about race and dyspraxia.
There's often a lot of expectations, I think, in the Black community. There's a lot of stereotypes of things that we do well. And that does tend to be things like athletics and so sports, and Black women are essentially often expected to be quite domesticated as well. So I think that's where a lot of those internalized shame would come from, that I feel like I definitely learned, and it was from a lot of trial and error, how to cook and do things. But I would often find things like cooking a variety of, especially being from a Ghanaian background, Ghanaian meals quite challenging because there was a lot of steps. It would often mean having to open a lot of things like plum tomatoes and things like that, and there would be struggles. I would often find home economics, as they used to call it in school, quite challenging because it would just mean a number of steps and opening things and doing things that just weren't the easiest. Textiles, I just was not good at school as well, because I think it was a lot of that sewing and just that hand-eye thing. And I think it was a thing that people would expect you to be better at, and that a lot of the Black people I was around did seem to be better at. I think generally when it comes to neurological conditions, there is still a lot of that stigmatization and fear in our communities, because when it comes to the education and health system, there's often been fraught relationships with the Black community. Black boys and girls tend to be more stigmatized in school and have kind of those challenges. So sometimes you fear any additional labels. You don't want to be labeled as dyspraxic or having ADHD or anything like that, because that kind of seems like another label that's going to cause problems for you. So there's something that I probably did have a fear of, and especially in uni when I'm already just trying to survive and do well, there was kind of that fear. So I think that's some of it. And like I said, back to the being athletic, it's just something that I think people expect with basketball, with football, with netball, and they were just things that were not naturally I was good at, and I'd just be looked at as, "You're tall, you're Black, what? This should become easy to you." And it's like, no, it requires too many steps.
I'm really struck by those expectations and that pressure, and that feels hard. Like, just hearing you talk about it, that feels difficult. And you just painting a picture of a kitchen and just thinking of actually how physical it is cooking, not in terms of like exercise, but the amount you have to do with your hands,
the steps
it requires, the coordination, the spatial awareness. There's obviously some danger in the kitchen too, right? Of like, there's fire and there's knives. So then I hear all this, you said the word shame a lot. And then I'm really struck by the fact that you emailed us. What's driven you to leave the civil service, go and do a TED talk? What's that drive?
Sometimes it's an out-of-body experience, because I'll hear those things and I'm like, I did that? That is crazy.
She got an MBE too, by the way.
Oh gosh, there's still a lot of imposter syndrome and that little girl in my head being like, that's not you. But I think there is that advocacy and that always wanting to, knowing how hard things are and how long it's taken me to figure things out. I just don't want that for younger people, especially younger Black girls. And I feel like I've always had that drive to be like, I want people to love their brains and find different ways to work with their brains, because I think that's just the saddest thing, that I feel like I was always putting so much effort and feeling like I was surviving, not necessarily thriving. So I'm really keen to kind of be that voice and amplify the voices of people who look like me and are from my backgrounds, because I think that intersectionality, and when you do have those kind of multiple identities that cross over, it can just feel harder and feel more like the only one. So I think, yeah, that's why I've really been just keen to do that.
Well, yeah, that's amazing and clearly needed. Let's talk about ADHD. So you were diagnosed. How did that come about? That was after dyspraxia.
Yes.
Tell me that.
So I first realized I had ADHD, I think it was around 2018. And I'd read an article by this mental health advocate called Penny Bell. And she was talking about her mind constantly being overloaded and being chronically overwhelmed, feeling like she had like loads of tabs. And she'd initially gone to the doctors because she thought it was, I think, something to do with PTSD from past trauma she'd had. And they said that was part of it, but it'd probably been exacerbated because she had ADHD. And then I was reading all of this and I thought, wow, this aligns with how I feel. But it was something, prior to that, I'd associate ADHD with young boys, kind of running around. It was not something I associated with myself. So as we do as ADHDs, kind of went down that rabbit hole, reading up on stuff, reading on different experiences. And I was like, I think this is something that aligns with me. And I didn't do much with it until about 2020, which I think a lot of people during the pandemic, things were really kind of just, I think, hard. And I just felt like I was doing a lot of work. In the time in the civil service, I was working in the communities department and I was doing a lot of work with Black and Asian minority people and how they were coping with the pandemic. And I was also doing work. I ran the race network in our department, so I was doing a lot of work to support people there. And this was kind of in the height of what happened with George Floyd and a resurgence of talking about Black Lives Matters. And I felt like I was pouring and trying to help all these people and I just wasn't coping myself. So I just felt like things got too much. And I was like, I think I need to look into this because I'm feeling burnt out. And it obviously could be the times, but I think there's more support that I need. So I was like, I need to go about trying to get this ADHD diagnosis. So I initially spoke to my workplace and they were like, we can't get you kind of like a formal diagnosis, but we could probably get some kind of support in place, like a workplace assessment.
Okay.
And I spoke to the occupational health team they had there, and they kind of were like, based on this information, it does seem like when we spoke to them that it does seem like it's ADHD. So they kind of put things in work. And I thought, okay, maybe if I take this to my GP, it's something to kind of start the process. So I went to my GP and that seemed to be taking a while. And then I found out about Right to Choose.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, this is something where I can actually kind of advocate for myself to my GP, being like, okay, you've got this document that shows that I can need some support in the workplace, but can you also kind of hurry up this process because it looks like it's going to take a while.
Because I'm impatient too.
Yes,
so.
And I need this to move. And I still felt like it was, which when I did my research later on, speaking to other people and other Black women especially, I still felt like with my GP, I really had to kind of advocate and really prove. And it was kind of still a conversation of, you've done well in school. It seems like all this stuff. And it's like, yeah, but I still feel like there's these symptoms and I need further support. So can we kind of push this along? And eventually I was able to go through the process and took 9 months and I was able to get that ADHD diagnosis, which can sound long, but it's much shorter than a lot of people's experiences not going through the private system.
Yes. And how did that feel?
It's like you go through the grieving process. You feel kind of anger at why it took so long, but then you also feel like, oh, like liberated in a way, like I knew it was something. And so I feel like it was a mix of things. And then, yeah, kind of just that shame. And then you start reflecting, thinking maybe this could have been easier or this could have been better if I knew earlier on. So I feel like it was such a mix of emotions when I got it. But I do remember bursting into tears when he told me, which I think threw him off a bit. But I just felt like there was a sense of validation of it's not just in my head. There's like something that to associate with this. So, yeah.
And what had you seen in terms of representation of ADHD at that point?
Anyone who looked like me. So Penny Bell, she's a mixed race woman. So that was something that I could align with me, and hearing her get an ADHD diagnosis at 30, and then I was 30 when I eventually got mine. So that was the representation. But prior to that, I did not know. And then until I started going down that rabbit hole and finding out about people like Mel B. She has ADHD and Dyspraxia, which is why I feel like I've always loved her, but it makes sense why I love her so much. And Simone Biles and SZA and Solange Knowles. So I feel like I had to kind of do that research, and now it's definitely more of a conversation. But when I was first looking into it, Penny Bell, I think, was the main person I first saw, but there was probably still that internalized ableism of thinking like, I don't think this is associated with me. I'm not a young boy who like runs around. And then I had to really think about, no, like my ADHD definitely shows up in other ways, like internalized in my brain is always on the go. I can't sleep often. I've always never been able to sleep well. I'm a hoarder. I like lose things a lot. I'm easily distracted. So it was just about really understanding that it can often show up differently in women.
Why do you think women, girls have basically been missed from a diagnosis perspective?
The early research was done on white, cis, hetero men and young boys. So that's kind of all the pool they had. And I think in societies, women were often taught to socialize and assimilate. So that's why it can often just be seen differently. And like, often a lot of the things that I now learn are my ADHD traits were just seen as personality traits. So she's a daydreamer, she loses things, she's a bit scatty, she's very chatty. They're seen as just kind of personality traits as opposed to kind of a mix of both. There's symptoms of your ADHD as well. So, and I think, there's often a lot of expectations placed on women, like I said, to kind of look after people and be caring and stuff that I don't want to say you can't afford to have ADHD, but it's like they almost just doesn't want to look at it being other things.
And so then let's talk about Black people and ADHD, because that's also, from the bit I do understand, been massively missed.
Yes.
Why, and what do we need to do about it?
Again, I think there tends to be a mix of reasons how I think Black people often perceived in society, often the kind of lack of grace and empathy that there can be for Black people, I think, in society. So especially when I was doing a lot of the research, I remember speaking to one woman who her child was going kind of through the ADHD diagnosis process and she thought she had ADHD. And she said a teacher actually told her that, oh, Black boys don't have ADHD. They tend to just have more behavioural problems. So often kind of looking at them in another way. And I'd also done research especially when I was doing my TEDx on Black girls and Black women. And adultification is something that commonly happens. And that is the idea that Black boys and girls are looked at as more mature than they are. So because they're kind of looked at as older than they kind of are not looked at as children and often given the support they need. So when I was looking at this report, Black girls were saying that they kind of did need more support, but they were kind of seen as just being rude, dismissive. It wasn't like thought that they kind of need that support, and it could be ADHD. So I think that can happen. And you see that even in things like the criminal justice system, where Black people are more likely to be sentenced and Black children. I think it's the idea that they're looked at as more adult-like and not as children.
Why is that?
I think there's just been, when you look at kind of the history of Black people and their experiences, to kind of being looked at as sometimes subhuman or older and not. So I think from that young age, you're sometimes not getting the support you need until much later on in life. So I think that's often part of the reason.
I know you've said that, and correct me if I'm wrong,
Black girls
are twice as likely to be expelled.
Yeah, and that was some of the reasons that came up in that report, that they were kind of, some of their behaviours were seen kind of as just rude and dismissive and not really seen as needing that further support. So I think that can often come up, and there is that stigmatisation. And then that links to why sometimes families can be less likely to want to have any association with any kind of neurological conditions, because you see the education and health providers, there's often like a fraught relationship between Black communities, because you see that Black people are more likely to kind of be sectioned, or things can kind of exacerbate without getting that help earlier on. Sometimes there can be that real fear of, I don't want my child to be labelled as troublesome or stupid. And it's often not understanding that your child just has a different way of learning things. It doesn't mean that they're stupid. It's just that they need that help to be able to really thrive in the ways that are needed. So I think that can often be something. There can be that real fear to have kind of any labels put on you and that support. So I think that can often happen as well.
I find it really shocking and sad that you've had to go and do a talk about the fact that Black girls can have ADHD.
Yeah.
Why did you want to do that talk?
It's really important that we are supporting people from marginalized and underrepresented communities. And we are showing the diversity when it comes to being literally the word neurodivergent. It's in there.
Yes.
And I think sometimes we're often only seeing people that look a certain way getting represented. And it's important that we're understanding people from a race, gender, disability, working class background. There needs to be more of that representation. So I just really wanted to show my kind of own lived experience and kind of my own journey, but also talk about what I think needs to be done more to support other people who look like me to make sure that they're getting a diagnosis and getting the support they need.
Were you nervous?
Oh yes, I was nervous. And TEDx's are not ADHD friendly. They're not neurodivergent friendly. They require you to memorize things. I know, I think this is a very typical ADHD trait where you have that RSD. I still have not watched it. I think I watched 2 minutes of it and I was like, this is cringe. But I know.
I've watched it twice.
Oh, thank you. But I know I had to do. I remember even when I got it sent to me, being just fearful to put it out there. And I thought, you're doing a disservice and you're being selfish because you did this for a reason to help people. So put it out there. What will be, will be. And when I see the comments and the feedback and people come up to me, I'm like, okay, it was important and I'm glad I did it. So yeah, it was definitely had its challenges. I think TEDx need to be more neurodivergent friendly and encourage. If people do need cue cards and things like that, they should.
Yeah.
Because that's
so
helpful.
You couldn't.
No, I think I've heard one or two people saying from their experiences that they were able to, but yeah, they were very kind of like, no, which I feel like I should have probably pushed back. But again, I feel like you still feel guilty of masking or wanting to be good as everyone else. So I was like, if everyone else is doing this, I have to do it that way, which of itself is not the best way to do things because I know that I do things differently and I'm literally talking about it in the talk that I do something differently and still in some ways trying to conform to how everyone else is doing things.
Yeah, and it's a tricky balance to strike, isn't it? And I guess, oh, wow, I'm going to do this TEDx talk and right, well, I don't want to ruffle too many feathers or I don't want to ask too much or I want to appear like, yeah, no, it's okay, I can do this.
And I think there's still that imposter syndrome often of just feeling grateful, being grateful to being somewhere that makes you feel like I have to just try to do things as well as them. And that is something actually that often comes up with ADHD as well. And I think Black people's experiences, that kind of being from like an immigrant family, you're often taught to just work twice as hard. You have to assimilate. Things are going to be harder for you. So I feel like that's something that I've still always had to really work with, the idea that my brain works differently and it's okay to need more support. But I think you're often taught that as a Black person, things are going to be hard. So you just have to push yourself harder. So that's why I always thought I wouldn't have thought it was something like ADHD and Dispraxia and that I just need to do things a different way. You're just thinking, well, as someone from a minority background, you do have to work harder anyway. So just do it. So I feel like that is something that is a lot of people's experiences from a minority background and still often plays in my head when I'm in spaces.
And so in the last 3 years, what have you seen that gives you real hope about neurodivergence in the Black community?
I think it is the community out there that's helping. And I know people can often have mixed feelings about things like social media, but I think social media has done a great job of bringing so much awareness. Things like your podcast, and I first saw your podcast on social media. So you see like that awareness and people being able to share their stories, and there is great communities out there. Like I mentioned, the Black Dyspraxic. There's this amazing community group called ADHD Babes, which help Black girls and non-binary people with ADHD, and they do great work. And then you're in a space with other people who have your like specific experiences. So I feel like there's been so much that's been done that's great about that community. And I think representation, you are seeing so much more of those conversations online, in the media. So I think that's really important. I think for the first time, was it last year, I watched Waterloo Road, and Kelly Jo, I think she's called. So that's the first time I'd seen a Black girl's representation. She was a mixed race girl, and she was really talking about this sensory overload, but she was deemed in school as aggressive and all those kind of often stereotypes that Black girls often have to face, the angry Black girl, the strong Black girl. So I feel like they showed a really good portrayal of her having ADHD, realizing she had ADHD and putting support in place. And I hadn't seen that representation before. It was really good.
Your work so you left the civil service in the beginning of this year.
Yes.
Why did you leave the civil service?
My role was so busy, I didn't feel like I was getting to often do a lot of kind of the advocacy work and direct work on the neurodivergent side that I wanted to do. And to some degree, I wouldn't say necessarily a conflict of interest, but especially my last role working in the Department of Health, and I was often kind of critical about the long waiting lists and things like that. It was probably a bit challenging to be working in the department and then being a bit critical of some of the things as well. So,
and what do you think needs to change from your experience of being, within policy and the civil service, and then also having this amazing experience of, I guess, what I would call more frontline, direct outreach work within communities? What needs to change?
There's quite a few things, but I'd say the main things are there definitely needs to be a lot more investment into kind of SEND and supporting people who are disabled, people with neurological differences. I think the waiting lists are astronomical at the moment, so long, and it can often feel like a postcode lottery when you speak to people and their different experiences getting diagnosis is just not consistent. It's a luxury to be able to get a private diagnosis. That's not something a lot of people can do, and we need to look into how we can reduce those waiting lists to support people from all kinds of diverse backgrounds and needs. I think there needs to be kind of a real review and looking at education providers, healthcare providers. There probably needs to be a lot of training for GPs. They can often be the first gatekeepers to getting your diagnosis. And often I've spoken to people who've said that, like one of my friends is a GP, and she's like, there's not a lot of, you don't do a lot of studying when it comes to understanding neurological conditions and things like that. So I think there needs to be more training and making sure you are thinking about that intersectionality. So thinking about different people's experiences, so you're not making stereotypes and presuming things from people from different minority backgrounds that can make it harder to get that diagnosis. Because like I said, the GPs are often the first, they are that gatekeeper to getting you to that next stage. So I think there needs to be a lot of training to make sure things are inclusive.
The work that you do going into organizations and training people, there's so many layers to all of this, and so many people are at such different levels of understanding. How do you navigate that going into a business or an organization and talking about neurodivergence?
Yes, I always kind of start with a bit about what kind of these neurological differences are, and then really trying to have those kind of real case studies and understanding. So really kind of getting this understanding, a work perspective, how ADHD and dyspraxia and autism, how it can affect your working surroundings, how to navigate kind of these conversations. And I always am really keen on placing it kind of on employers and managers to really support people. And the idea that we want neuro-inclusive environments that benefit everybody, really trying to focus on understanding from younger years as well, because I really want to be able to kind of help more in schools. And I think it is so important. I want younger people to not have to get to like their adult years and really work this out, but to feel like empowered. So I've got to work with Kids, which is an amazing organisation that works with disabled and neurodivergent children. And it's been amazing to work with these kids and for them to just kind of be free in the play space and to like, where they often have so much shame in the real world, they get to be free and find ways, different ways to communicate. And so that's what I'm really keen on as well, kind of working with younger people as well to help them feel like, not to feel shame and to be able to have those conversations with their families and kind of be proud that they're neurodivergent.
Yeah, it's the cycle that we need to break and the future that we need to rewrite or help rewrite or work with young people to rewrite, I guess. Let's talk about your MBE.
Yes. I felt a bit conflicted at first when I was offered it because there's definitely connotations and I think they need to change the empire word in it.
Yes.
But then when I like thought about it and I read like the people, it was a lot of the communities, groups and people that I'd worked with in the community who thought that I was worthy of this for the work I'd done. I thought, okay, to honour them and to be a representative in this space, then I will pick it up. And there is still a lot of imposter syndrome with it again. So it's a weird one, but it's something that I am proud of what it represents for the people who thought that I was worthy and I was doing important work in the community.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because ultimately you've been nominated.
Yeah.
And so people in the communities that you've worked in think that you deserve this.
Yeah.
And that it's a great recognition of the work that you've done.
Yeah.
But that empire word, I hear you. It's pretty loaded.
Exactly. And that's why I always say, again, it's a personal choice because a lot of things in the community about people saying that it's not for them and people turning it down. I think that's your total right. But then there also shouldn't be shame if people decide that that's something that they do want. Like, I think you have to do, what's best for you with it. But yeah, it was definitely...
congrats.
Thank you. And it was nice to see. It was Windsor that we saw, and meet Prince Charles. And I've got to give it to him because how old is he? He must be in his 70s. He took the time to like really speak to me and be like, oh, it's great the work you've kind of done with vaccine hesitancy and helping different communities. And I did some work during Grenfell to support. But yeah, it was definitely very surreal.
I think it's, I think it's brilliant.
Thank you.
And I think you've got this fantastic opportunity and platform, I guess, given you've got such a brilliant, grounded, thorough experience from the civil service of really understanding how ultimately, policy gets made and outreach happens and how important communities are and that work within communities, that it's almost like you going and standing up for neurodivergence in the Black community is what you were meant to do.
Oh, thank you.
Because you've had all this training that wasn't all about ADHD and dyspraxia.
Yeah.
Because you weren't diagnosed for most of it.
Yeah, so I definitely feel, and it's always interesting because I do look back and I always feel like, because Mom was always saying that you've always been the person who wants to fight for the underdog and like always pushing for big things. And I'm like, I just always thought, because I was used to often being kind of the only person who looked like me and stuff. But now I realize that it's that added layer also of, I think, that ADHD. And I think we do tend to be justice sensitivity warriors and we really want to push and advocate for people. So I feel like it's now kind of just, you're constantly understanding why you do things the way you do.
What message do you give to undiagnosed, misdiagnosed, going through a diagnosis, recently diagnosed Black people?
I say it's a journey and that's okay. Be kind to yourself. I think we tend to be our biggest critics. Have compassion and be patient with yourself. And I always say if you've kind of done all the research and you've read everything, then you are most likely neurodivergent, and it might take a while, but I feel like kind of doing a lot of that research helped me advocate for myself to get that diagnosis. And hopefully you are able to, if you're not, continue to kind of use communities like this and different representation out there to help you like take in all that learning and find different ways to work with your brain. That's what I would encourage, because unfortunately not everyone is going to be able to get that diagnosis. It could take a while, it can take years, but kind of feel empowered that there is a community out there who will support you and you're not the only one. Yeah,
nice. We asked you to bring an item that represents your brain. What did you bring?
So I kind of have two in a way. One that's on me.
What? This is a recurring theme.
Yes,
that we ask people to bring one and they bring three.
Is a big... So I've kind of got like two in a way. So one is on me. It's the leopard print. So one, I take a step back. Not only is Mel B, I mentioned Mel B, who has ADHD and Dyspraxia. She was the original OG leopard print lover and I love her. She's just amazing. But I read that it represents resilience, authenticity and shape-shifting, which I think is a very ADHD kind of trait that we're always kind of shape-shifting and masking. So that's something that I feel like represents me. I'm known for my leopard print. And then the second one is my water bottle. I've had like quite a few of these because I lose them a lot, but I tend to be dehydrated. I'm not good at drinking water. And I got this water bottle to remind me, I mean, I've not done a good job today because I haven't drunk any, but to remind me to keep on going. It's got kind of the times on them, 8 a.m., 9 a.m. It's got some good motivational words on it that I think is important for an ADHD. It helps you go in, get started, remember your goal, keep chugging, don't give up, almost there. So I think they're the two things that represent me.
I love it. Firstly, my middle daughter, her favourite animal is the leopard.
Oh.
And I didn't know that about what the leopard represents. So I'm looking forward to telling her what that means. She also loves multicoloured water bottles too.
Yes.
So you guys would...
Great. Yes. I think
you guys would get on.
We'll get on so
you guys would get on. Abigail, thank you.
Oh, thank you.
I've really enjoyed learning from you. And I think there's loads still to learn on dyspraxia, right? Mm-hmm. And there's loads of awareness of just what that word means and is for people. There's clearly lots of challenges where ADHD in girls is concerned, but you keep coming back to this thing of representation, and you're living proof. And so hopefully we can, pass that down and pass that along, because it's really important. So thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
And keep smashing it.
Thank you. This has been great. You too. I love your podcast. So I'm honored to be on it.
Thank you. Because I'm autistic, I think differently. And back in 2015, I wanted people to drink differently. So I created Seedlip, the world's first distilled non-alcoholic spirits. I took Seedlip from my kitchen to 35 countries and the world's best bars, restaurants, and retailers. And we did it in 3.5 years. It was wild. They're delicious. They're intriguing. They're these distilled botanical blends you can just mix with tonic or have in a cocktail. You really don't need another sickly, horrible mocktail. Check us out on seedlipdrinks.com or Amazon and let me know what you think.